Hi and welcome to the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month we're talking to Charles Radclyffe, entrepreneur and data philosopher. We're talking about dubious business models, narratives of ethics, using the court system for preemptively working through issues with the automated cars. And we also have a lovely heated conversation near the end about our favourite, the Trolley Problem. We've had some technical issues on the website, so sorry if you're having problems downloading the podcast. You can find it at themachine-ethics.net, on YouTube if you search for Machine Ethics Podcast, or you can support us on patreon.com/Machine Ethics. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy.
Hi Charles.
Hi.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's really great to meet you. If you could just quickly tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got here.
Absolutely. So my name is Charles Radclyffe, and I call myself a data philosopher. And I should probably start with explaining what I think that means. And it comes back from a few years ago when I used to run a data analytics company in London. And my frustration was the metaphors that are used by the technology world are so poorly fitted to what it is actually that we're doing. And I think initially my response was in relation to sort of data warehousing as a concept, which to me had kind of very little to do with what actually a warehouse would be built to do, to kind of store things, but on part of the supply chain. Data warehousing was much more of a archiving library type model, where you want data to kind of live, be clean, and stay forever. It was a time, sort of the early part of the decade, where the idea of data science started to come into the common parlance, and we had data scientists. Big data. Yeah. We had data scientists that worked for us, I was talking about how actually, design thinking and interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches to solving problems was, in my view, superior way. And how we've seen that in other industries, and actually how very little of what a data scientist does is actually a very good metaphor for science. They're kind of just statisticians with
data analysts rather than scientists. Maybe.
Yeah, analysts or just kind of stats people with a bit of hacker skills. And I'm doing the whole industry a big disservice by saying that. But actually, a lot of the problems that we face, with what we do in the data world, suddenly starts looking at kind of ethical kind of questions. And I was asking a lot of those kind of how and why type questions at this event. And I said at the time, what we really need, but maybe, and I said the great luxury a philosopher has is philosophers just ask questions. They don't.
Right. They don't have the answers.
They don't have answers. No. And I think good philosophers just to stay with the questions. So I said what we need are more data philosophers, and the name kind of stuck from there.
Yeah.
And so since then I started a blog, and I talk on the subject of digital ethics. And what's really interesting, and this is why it's great to meet you, because we're kind of doing very similar things, is there's a lot of people from the technology world with tech skills who recognise this. And they have podcasts, or they have blogs, or they write books. I've just finished reading a book by Max Tegmark, who's an astrophysicist at MIT and started the Future of Life Institute, which is looking at the future of AI.
Is that Life 3.0?
That's the one, yeah. Great book. But it's a book written very much from an astrophysicist's perspective and view on the world. And he starts this Future of Life Institute, which is asking all the questions like, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of AI? What are we trying to achieve? And they have all the great and the good from the AI world, like Margaret Bowden and Murray. I can't remember his surname. I can't remember his surname. See his face. Stuart Russell and others. And they've got like a token philosopher. There, which is Sam Harris.
But Stuart Russell asked a lot of these questions as well, though, I think.
But that's the thing, is that these are tech people.
Yeah.
These are computer scientists. Kurzweil, he's a computer scientist, and they face the kind of ethics, philosophy questions. And very, very seldom have I seen them actually try to engage with kind of, I would say, mainstream or classical. And I see this as a lot of the problems, my kind of social commentary with my Data Philosopher blog is around how the tech world seems so ill-equipped to answer some of these problems and doesn't realise sometimes that there's probably 2,000 plus years of thinking and not answers acceptably, but there's an element of hubris within the tech world that we can change the world. We're so powerful with what we do with technology, and we have been commercially successful, like the Zuckerbergs and Musks of the world. That's their proof that they are all powerful and all knowledgeable, and therefore this thing that philosophers have kind of struggled with for 2,000 years, we will try and solve without inviting them to the party. And so that's really kind of a lot of the way I come at this is, I'm not a techie. I'm a geek, but I think there's a difference between someone who's a bit geeky and actually properly techie. So I'm kind of humanities, liberal arts trained. I'm a lawyer by training. So I come at these questions of ethics from a very different angle. But I love the technology world and I love working with very technical people. But I think I bring something different to that. And a lot part of what I'm trying to do is trying to encourage more people from humanities backgrounds to engage with these questions, because I think these questions are so important.
Do you have what set you down this line originally? So was it to do with the personal data maybe side of things that you maybe had to deal with during work, or was it to do with more big data and how we are using this data, like how we're using this data in a dubious fashion to help the economic impact of some company, or what was it that kind of maybe set you off to try and think more about this subject?
I think it was my own experience as a consumer, as well as a supplier to the industry, and I think my consumer experience was, I looked at the kind of the growing rise of kind of cloud services, probably 10 years ago now, and realizing that actually what cloud was describing is just another fancy word for client-server architecture, but one where you're paying a sort of subscription fee, and things like Dropbox, for example, I have an allergic reaction to, because essentially they're taking money off people like you and me to store our data. And where we've got loads of free storage space on our phones. I mean, my phone, I reckon, has got 50 gig of storage. My laptop has got probably 3 times that. So we have all this connected technology ourselves in our pockets and at home. I'm a geek, so I've got loads of computers all connected to the internet at any one point in time with free storage. And yet our solution to backing up our data and having it accessible and synced with all our devices is to pay some third party to store it on a server for us, and that becomes our kind of golden source of truth. And to me, we could solve that problem using a distributed solution that's actually free.
I think that really resonates with me, because I think there are very interesting products on the internet, for instance, for technological products, which are maybe you could even call them social or societal or citizen products. And one of those is email, because email's free, and email you can set up yourself, and you can have an email server, and that's your email server, and that's your email, and people can send email to you,
on a AWS.
Exactly. You can set it on a cloud or like a hosting company, right? And that's yours, and you can look after that, and that's great. And what you said is true. It's very much the case that you could set up hire a server somewhere and sync all your devices to it, and that would take a little bit of effort, but you could do it, and that would be a distributed thing that you could make yourself. And we could do this with lots of things.
But what you could use, I use, this is my plug at an anti-Dropbox solution. I use a company called Resilio, has a product called Sync, which does exactly the same thing a Dropbox does, but you don't upload all your files into a server, it just literally syncs them peer-to-peer between the devices.
Yes, you have to be online at the same time, don't you?
You have, for it to really work practically, you have to have at least one of the devices online, but I think for most of us that is actually true. For me, that's always true. I've got at least a number of devices online. As you get all the advantages of Dropbox, but it's a kind of open source-ish project they're trying to commercialize. But the very interesting about Sync is that they were born out of the it was a BitTorrent product actually originally.
Right.
And so when they initially started to go to market to enterprise clients, they really struggled having that BitTorrent relationship, and they've ended up rebranding. But I think that's the thing about sort of engineering solutions to be, it's like self-storage companies in the real world. They say, oh, you've got this junk in your house, you can clear your house, and you can put it in a container, and you'll pay like £10 a month. And you'll be like, oh, this is really easy. Oh, actually, I'll have a bigger container. I'll pay £50 a month. Yeah. And then you don't pay it for whatever reason, or you forget to pay, and they write you a letter and they say, unless you pay what we owe, we're going to burn all your stuff or give it to we're going to sell it on eBay. Yeah. And most people are highly motivated to quickly pay that bill. Yes. So self-storage companies are vultures on people's sense of wanting to hold their own, wanting to keep their things that mean something to them. And the cloud storage companies are the same, but for our data. I think it was that kind of started me thinking about this more. Yeah. And then just about essentially you mentioned Gmail. Gmail offended me so much when it first started 10 years ago, or more than that now, but maybe about 10 years ago. I was hosting my own Microsoft Exchange server for my firm, and it was expensive. It's Microsoft Exchange, so it has limitations. And Gmail came along and it had all these features, and it looked great. And it was free, and they were giving away, insane-sized mailboxes for free, which compared to my quite expensive Exchange server, this is pre-Office 365, was quite appealing. But when I realised that what Google were doing with my data and how they were looking to profile me, that's when I had an allergic reaction to it and said, I'm quite happy to use Gmail. I'll be really up for using Gmail, but I want the choice to pay. Yes. And at the moment they don't offer that choice to pay. You can either have they do now, but you have a free service, or you have no service. And the bargain is the free service. They get to mine your data and they get to use that.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? Is that it's not a transparent bargain. It's not. You're not going to read all the T's and C's necessarily, because there's going to be a lot of information there.
Who does?
To discover that they're going to be doing some nefarious stuff with your data, or stuff that you didn't necessarily sign up for. And I think maybe that's worse. Not that they're doing it at all, but that they're doing it in a way that is not obvious to anyone, and especially us being kind of interested in the technology and being maybe more on the nerdy side. You would have thought that we would be more technically literate to be able to find that information, but it's still very difficult to work out, is my phone spying on me, is my email spying on me, and all these things, and what's really happening with that information.
No, exactly. I mean, I think transparency is one thing which is paramount. And I think recently, and I do feel that there will be a backlash towards tech companies if they don't get this right. I mean, Apple recently with their slowing down old phones. The transparency was the problem. But I think with Gmail, the other side of this, which was so insidious, is how email and credit to Google in terms of whoever sat in their strategy meeting and went, oh wow, if we were to offer email for free and make it awesome, we would get all these customers. And if we get enough critical mass of customers on our platform, we then basically own email. And what the penny dropped with me when I realised that actually it didn't really matter whether I had a Gmail account or not, because I correspond with so many people who do have Gmail accounts that Google actually know quite a lot about me and how I write, the words I use. They can profile me just as easily without me ever actually signing up for their service. Now, I'm sure they don't. They know who you are. But they know who I am. And suddenly I realised that actually there's a lot of examples of that where tech companies can fly quite close to the wind when it comes to ethics and maybe even the law. In order to grab a market, and then once they've grabbed that market, then they can clean up their act and that's what recently happened with Google last year. They said, we're going to change our T's and C's, we're not going to mine your data. And it's like, well done, Google. It's fine for you to say that now you are undisputably the king of email. What happened to all of those email hosting businesses that you put out of business?
And what happened to all that data that you've probably already got as well?
Exactly. So that's my issue with as a consumer when it comes to email. So a little bit of a tangent.
No.
And professionally, just one more thing. So from the professional side, I very rarely came across an example of a client who said, "Oh, we've got all this data and how do we kind of, greedy eyes, how do we kind of get as much value? But there was one instance which was I won't name the client for fear of lawsuits, but a well-known organisation that wanted to start a digital-only bank, and there's lots of reasons why that's a good idea.
Yep.
And they already have a financial services product. And one of the things they said in the meeting, and this is kind of, again, gave me an allergic reaction, was they said, we've got all this, what we realised, I said, why do you want to do this? What are you trying to achieve? And the guy in the room said, quite innocently, we've got all this data. It's amazing. Like, if we really tried, we know so much about our customers, but we don't. And surely, like, if we were just to be able to kind of join all this data up, get more information about what they spend money on and where they spend it, we could monetize that data. And I said, I don't think that's a reason to set up a bank. And I think if you express that in those words to your customers, they would have some serious issues. And I think you need to have a different reason for doing this. And I think you need to have a absolute watertight kind of data privacy, data ethics approach to this. And actually that would be a high differentiator, because I think a lot of your competitors may be thinking along the lines that you just described, and may not express it quite in those words. And he said, okay, well, that's just our kind of compliance department or our marketeers who kind of need to kind of fluff up the language. But the reality is that every bit of data that we have has a value, and we could cash that in. And I was like, I don't want to be a part of this project. And that was very much a statement on my part. So good luck. I just want to have nothing to do with it. There was one instance I've seen of something which I had a real issue with, and that's another problem I think with us as technologists and working in the tech world, is that we face, and I did a survey of my team. I said, like, how would you solve an ethical problem on the coalface? And the answers varied, and basically it's an individual producer kind of, we rely on individual people doing the right thing or trying to seek help in their own way. And very few companies actually have a mechanism to help people who are facing those sort of ethical challenges on the coalface work them through. And also we are, or techies are probably quite ill-equipped to solve these problems, because the training techie people receive is in the technology and not necessarily in the classics. And I think bringing those two worlds together is a key thing.
So what do you think they need? I mean, let's say there are individuals who are interested in making organisations better, what could they benefit from having? Or do they just listen to the podcast, or they read your blog and then everything's okay? Or,
I think reading up on this subject and podcasts and blogs, I think, is a great starting point, and hopefully gets people interested. But there's a lot of this stuff. Tegmark's recent book is a good example of something which is, I don't think acknowledges quite truly what the problem is, which is, it comes back to that paradigm of, we're techies, we're commercially successful techies, therefore we're right. We see philosophical, ethical problems, we're going to apply science to solving it, and we're just going to kind of brute force our way through. And to hell with you if you have a different view. And I think there's an alternative stance to that, which is really what the ethos of my blog's about. But in terms of organisations, I think digital ethics is not something that's taken seriously by anyone really. And you might say, okay, well, Google have got an ethics board, or Facebook have an ethics board. Yes, they do, but they meet behind closed doors and they have private conversations about this. That is very much like the tobacco industry in the 1950s, where the world's going, oh, do you know what, this might be bad for people, and tobacco companies are like, no, it's all fine, we've got it under control. And then 30 years later, in a lot of lawsuits, the truth comes out. And that's pretty much what we're seeing today. We are seeing big tech companies having ethics committees discussing this problem, funding. Musk put in $10 million into the Future of Life Institute. He's publicly said he's worried about this stuff. And that's good. I'm glad that people like him are putting cash in and sparking debate. But so little of this debate is actually fully inclusive at the grassroots, including non-technical people. And the only interaction that non-technical people gets to this stuff is, sensationalist headlines in the Sun saying your job will be terminated, which came out like 2 weeks ago.
It's a constant treadmill, I think, with the news and that sort of headline at the moment, with fear-mongering almost about these sorts of technologies.
And so there's a different way, though, I think, about getting some dialogue and trying to get people, and that's what I try and do. But I think one thing, one of my own experience, I just did a stint to work for a large financial services organisation, and there was a couple of examples there of technology being brought into the bank to solve problems, but kind of posing, I would say, questions about should we be doing this or should we not be doing this. And I won't go into a detailed example.
You can if you really want to.
No, it's not worth the hassle. But it's fair to say that I think that's fairly typical of every big organisation going, oh, there's a clever bit of technology. We could solve a problem with this. And I remember 2 examples of me, in those meetings saying, whoa, guys, why are we doing this? And then you're getting because it's saving money or because it's giving a better customer experience or whatever. And it's like, really? And then you kind of go into kind of the real reason why. I think acknowledging that is important. Whether there's a judgment on that reason is beside the point. And then the second thing is, I think once you can kind of step through that thinking process, then more people suddenly go, oh, do you know what? Ooh, this suddenly feels a bit icky, and maybe we shouldn't be doing this after all. The challenge you've got is if you go to, and banking is a good example, because banking, 10 years ago, banks kind of really had to clean up their acts, a lot more regulation, a lot more emphasis on compliance in the culture of the organisation. So it'd be much less likely now for there to be a very overtly questionable business practice being conducted in a bank without somebody slamming the door on it. I mean, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, commonplace. Now, much, much less likely. I'm not saying it's impossible, but much less likely. And the mantra there is we have a compliance department which is there to try and avoid this stuff. And also they part of the mandatory training that everyone goes through if you work in a bank is that everyone is a risk manager. Everyone is in charge of compliance and ethics. And it's not something you can outsource to the compliance department, so it's their problem. If you spot something that you think is wrong, you could go to jail yourself if you don't say something.
This is a really interesting point. Do you think that it's just terminology? I mean, within these companies you say due diligence, risk, ethics, but do you think it's actually not about ethics? It is just about treading the line where the law is and being just underneath it?
It's not about, I don't think it's about treading the line of the law. I think it's about having a process to help people with, because most people don't understand law. Most people try and follow the law but haven't got a clue. And when it comes to something where they kind of brush up against the law, most people, I know a friend who called me up recently, and he was amateur lawyer, studied law at university, didn't practice. A friend at university, he got an angry letter from a company he owed some money to, taking him to court, and he was quite terrified. And this guy is an accountant, he's a professional person, he's an astute guy, but he was legitimately worried about criminality and concepts which had actually nothing to do with quite a petty debt. And so talking it through with him at first principles and saying, look, at the end of the day, it's up to you, pay the debt or have your day in court. At the end of the day, it's about making your case, agreeing the least hassle way forward. And if they find you have to pay the bill, you have to pay the bill, and that's fine. But that's not a criminal activity. But me having to explain that came from a lack of understanding on his part. No judgment on him. Why would he know any different? With compliance functions in banks, they spend a lot of time educating people as to this is what the law says, this is what our policy says, and this is how you should solve problems. But then when you face things that you don't feel equipped to solve, here's a mechanism to help you work through that, and we have this team of experts that can take the burden away.
Yeah.
So the whole compliance department's function is to be that radar system to kind of catch stuff before it goes wrong. What's really interesting is if you call a compliance department in a bank, and I happen to have done, and said, hey, I'm really worried about robot ethics and about AI, they like
not necessarily equipped to deal with that.
They thought it was a prank call.
Right.
It was like, really? That's funny.
Yeah.
We're worried about
one.
fixing libel. We're worried about fraud.
Yeah.
We're not worried about AI.
Yeah.
That's somebody else's problem.
But that's what I mean about there being this idea of ethics, but doesn't really exist in business in a meaningful way.
Tech ethics, yes. I think that's true. And I think there is a way to solve that. I think if you're a business that feels that your technology is a key part of your industry or your business, then you would have a head of technology or a head of innovation to kind of run that and own that and to implement that.
Yeah.
That person is very unlikely to have the first clue, apart from an amateur understanding of tech ethics. And I think at the very minimum, you need to have a conduit to solve that problem. And I think over time, the best practice is do what Google do, have a digital ethics committee, but absolutely have it in the public domain and open, and bring in your competitors, bring in your suppliers, your customers, because that's the forum for dealing with this stuff. Or
failing that, bring us in, right?
Or failing that, bring us in. But I mean, I think if Google hired me to kind of say, like, how do we solve our digital ethics problem?
Yes.
I would be helping them. I think the answer we would get to would be, let's have this debate in the public.
Yes, right. Do you think because that is practical for Google, right? Because Google is a large business. It's a very, very large business.
I think it's practical and necessary for Google.
Practical and necessary, yes. But maybe smaller businesses, let's say medium-sized businesses up to 150, something like that, it's not necessarily practical to have an ethics board. Do you think that's true, or do you think there's something else that those companies could do when they're getting to these issues where they have to deal with new technologies which are dealing with data, or how these things, algorithms are implemented in and affect people?
So I think that is much more the place that people like you and I can help. Look, I think small firm, big firms like Google and the bank that I've just been working for the last couple of years, they have teams of lawyers working in general counsel functions, and they can afford that luxury. Smaller firms might have an in-house lawyer, and really small firms might just have a law firm that they bring in from time to time. And I think that model is really what we need for digital ethics. And the problem we have today isn't the fact that companies, there aren't enough digital ethicists out there. The problem is that companies don't even realise that is an issue, and people at the coalface don't realise it's an issue, or try and deal with it in their own kind of random way. And people at the top kind of say, "Oh, it might be a problem one day, or it's not our problem; it's somebody else's problem." That's getting that imperative understood. Of like, look, if you're doing this, you need to be thinking about why you're doing it, how you're doing it,
and what kind of technologies are we talking about when we're talking about these companies that are trying to do these things and are hitting against these issues?
Well, obviously AI. It's the hot topic of today. So AI, automation, and robotics are the kind of three key ones, where it's really clear why we need to have a good understanding of digital ethics. But I think it's true of many other things. We talked about email earlier. I mean, I think there is a question as to whether Gmail was an ethical thing to do. And I would say, if they had offered Gmail you can have it for free, but we'll mine your data, or you can pay £5 a month and we won't.
Yes,
I think that's okay. I wouldn't have a problem with that, and I'd have an account.
And at least it'd be transparent. That case. You know that you chose the "I'm getting mined" button. You know what I mean? I just noticed your cuffs.
My cuffs.
Your cuffs.
Yes.
Does that lead anywhere?
It does. So it was a gift to me from many years ago when I was running my data analytics company. So anyone who can't see my cuffs, it's a QR code.
Etched into
my kind of metal cufflinks.
Yeah.
And it takes you to the website of my
Okay.
of my last company. But see, I'm a geek.
So you need newer ones then.
I just love them. I just think it was such a thoughtful gift.
I think they're great. I think if you can prove your nerdy credentials, there it is. Right
Yeah.
there. So sorry about that interlude.
No, that's fine. So in the absence of that, there was another mechanism, which is regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not necessarily massively a fan of regulation for regulation's sake, but I think there's such an absence of understanding and best practice right now. I feel strongly that we need regulation.
Did you see the government putting together that public AI board, ethics board, recently?
Yeah.
It was a couple of weeks ago.
Is it actually set up? I think it's just a commitment they've made to set one up.
They put together a white paper describing what that meant, basically.
Yeah.
And published that. And what I thought was really interesting about that, when you're talking about regulation, is that within that document there was no talk of regulation, legislation. There was no stick. It was just carrot, basically. So it was actually a committee basically promoting UK work within the field rather than any cracking down in any way, which was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I thought they'd taken that stance.
So I read a response to the IPPR report, which came out just after Christmas, which referenced that. The challenge I see with this is, we need to kind of have activity at all levels, and you need to have grassroots activity. I think we do need to have national regulators on this, but also at an international level. I don't mean the EU here. I mean, at a global level, because the challenge, and this will be something you're definitely familiar with, is that by not agreeing kind of the rules of the game, we can technology. I see technology is ultimately leverage, and that's one of the biggest reasons we seek to build technology, is to give ourselves better leverage. The really interesting thing about AI and automation and robotics is it's like leverage at the most extreme sense. And one expression of that is the amount of capital wealth that can be created by building this technology and licensing it to companies is really highly disproportionate to anything that we've seen in the past. And what's interesting is that the winners and the losers, like I said with Gmail, by doing things the wrong way, you can get. 2018, Gmail is absolutely synonymous with email. It's the platform, and they've got there, I think, by some sort of dubious methods. I think with AI and automation, we need to avoid the kind of the Gmail of AI, or the robotic of AI of Gmail kind of happening. But the problem is that you can't just have that in the UK. We're just going to do it properly. We're going to ban stuff that's not going to do it right. We need to have some sort of international cooperation on this. And I think the biggest divide I see, there's a big divide I see between the Silicon Valley mindset, and I'm a huge generalization there, because I know there's a diversity of opinion even within Silicon Valley. But compare that to the Bristol UK mindset, the former Silicon Valley, the Silicon Gorge. There's a very different approach between those two places, but a much bigger shift is between, I would say, the West and China. And it comes around the kind of data privacy squeamishness. And I use that phrase in a provocative sense, because we in the West typically are quite squeamish around data privacy. We don't like, Gmail just feels a bit icky because we don't like the idea of people spying on us, and I think quite for good reason, and that's certainly been my stance. I've been a sort of data privacy advocate most of my life.
Yeah.
In China, there's a very different mindset, which is actually your individual rights are much less important than the kind of the rights of society as a whole.
Right.
And so they don't really have this sort of data privacy squeamishness, nor really do they have a mechanism to agitate for it if they wanted it, which is a problem specific to China. But taking the sort of the data privacy points, if you look at what makes successful AI solutions, it's a combination of computational power, which is ubiquitous and cheap, and no one's really got advantage on that. You've then got the actual quality of the algorithms themselves, which again is a bit of an arms race.
Yeah, definitely.
Your skill set is the data there. The third thing is the data that you have and the quality of the data. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting from my perspective is that actually Chinese AI companies have a massive advantage over the rest of us because they have a lot less friction in order to get data on individuals and individual predilections of people.
Yep.
And I make no judgment as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's not always so clear cut. And I would say something like, if you were to give up your personal genetic data, and if that was to help a health service or a pharmaceutical company find a cure for cancer, then maybe that is, as Barack Obama has said, your moral imperative to do so.
Yeah.
I think there's one side of the argument that says that. On the other side of the argument, it says, well, no, my data is mine, and I shouldn't be coerced into giving it up.
If we go back to the kind of philosophy aspect of that, what you've basically stipulated is we've got this dual argument of data privacy for privacy's sake, which is quite Kantian, let's say, so it's quite duty-led, and then you've got the utilitarian side, which is, well, it depends on the outcome, it depends what we use it for, it depends if we are helping people, right?
Yeah.
So that's quite interesting.
But interesting that we're talking in terms of Western philosophy here, and I think this is where we need a much higher. And I'm not suggesting I'm equipped to offer any kind of real substance on this, but I think we come at things through the lens, and we play the language game that we play, and I think acknowledging that there's a different viewpoint on this, and trying to move to a point where at least you can have a conversation on common terms means that you can then start to hopefully bring those two sides of the argument together. And I think within Eastern philosophy, there's a very different psychology around the individual versus the collective, and we have a very individualistic sense in the West, and I think we make judgments based on that. I don't see any example of those two traditions thinking about this problem in that way, and I personally think that's the job of something like the UN to set up the Future of Life Institute that Tegmark did is great. I'm all for it, but I think that should be something the UN is doing, and just as much as solving human rights abuses and other very important things around the environment. We should be starting to look at digital ethics at that level, and because if we don't, what we end up with is a polarization of arguments as to which Western philosophy is the right one to apply to this. And then those in China will say, well, that's just
doesn't make
can't.
sense.
It's as foreign to me as.
So maybe we have to use the historical context of ethics and apply it in a new way, right? So we have to create a new form of ethics, and we're throwing all these terms around. We're saying tech ethics, machine ethics, digital ethics, data ethics, tech philosophy or whatever it is. But actually, what we're talking about is maybe creating some sort of common language of how you talk about these technologies and how they impact people, and that's kind of a murky area where we have to kind of navigate. And I think we should using these tools. I guess
we should be agreeing some ground rules as to what can and cannot be done. And lowest common denominator, I would suggest, is because of the effect of this technology has lowest common denominator is the place. And then within that, we can then start to look at policy questions as to should we be allowing autonomous machines to make kill decisions. I have particularly strong views on that, but I accept that other people might feel very differently.
What's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't think my opinion. I also want to stress, I don't think my opinion on that is any more valuable than anyone else's. I think the strongest thing I feel is that we should be having that conversation in the open as society. And I feel like we've kind of been conditioned to accept we have a state of reality today where we have autonomous vehicles that there's a human in the loop, and they perform some tasks on an autonomous basis, and there's a huge balance of power that can be created using that dynamic. And you might say, well, from a national security perspective, that's a good thing. Or you might say from a kind of sovereignty and sort of egalitarian perspective, it's wrong on others. Whatever your view on that. There's just not it's not something on the public agenda. It's something that's been decided behind closed doors with lawyers and politicians and maybe some ethicists around, but not society as a whole. And I think that if we can fix that, then we are some way to kind of getting to an answer.
I think on that point, I think the funniest thing that I see is that a lot of the people who are loudest talking about this don't know the technology, and I think that's really interesting. I don't think that we should throw these people out and that they are not relevant, but I think it's interesting that there's a lot of speak from people who aren't familiar with literally the technology, literally how you make something or how something is implemented or that sort of stuff, and that's one of the things that aggravates me being a technologist.
It's funny because what aggravates me is the opposite. It's technologists who don't understand.
Yes, but you need to make a bridge, right? So you need to bridge that gap. So you need both of those people on board. And if you have only one and not the other, then you can have a problem. You need both.
I mean, Alan Winfield is an example of I think someone who I'll caveat this by saying he's an awesome guy.
He's also been on the podcast.
He's been on the podcast. He's a great guy, and I think he's doing some great work. But I think there's I think the language game that he's playing is different from the language game that, say, I'm playing, and is different from the language game that most people play. And I think within that there's a risk. And so he's one of the things he says is, before you have ethical robots, you need to have ethical roboticists. Couldn't agree more. And I think that's great. But then he goes on to say, I've proven that I've built a robot that's made an ethical decision. And that's where suddenly his language game and my language game start to diverge. Because I don't think he has. I think he's made a robot that's expressed his ethical choice. And I think that's different. And then he goes further and he'll say, he's been involved in setting a standard on ethics for ethical design. And the idea is, and I think he actually used this phrase, and if he didn't, then I hope he forgives me for saying this. He says, it's basically like giving like an ethical kite mark stamp to products. That's where I suddenly have a real problem with this, because I think if you were to walk into a shop and you have two computers, just being facetious here, and one computer has all these specs and the other computer has all these specs, but one computer has the ethical stamp, it's like, oh, that's an ethical computer, that's somehow good. We associate the word ethical with somehow goodness. We conflate those two concepts, and so people will think, I'm going to buy the ethical machine because it's somehow good. There's nothing intrinsically good about that machine. If you look at humans, we are ethical machines. We make ethical decisions, and you and I are very different. Hopefully, our kind of standard of ethics isn't too different. But equally, there could be a mass murderer or child rapist or somebody who does horrific things that we would both have an ethical allergic reaction to if we talked about what they feel was right or wrong. But that's not to say that person is any less ethical being than we are. That person, unless they're a psychopath, they're still able to make ethical decisions. So we are all ethical beings. So by the Alan Winfield description, we would all get a tattoo on our forehead saying ethical person. And so I think breaking the technology world into psychopathic computers and ethical machines isn't actually very helpful, and is actually quite misleading.
I spoke to the Andersons, who I briefly forgot their names, who have also been on the podcast, and they wrote a book called Machine Ethics. So they kind of they didn't coin, but they almost coined the term, and they've been working. One of them is a technologist, one is a philosopher.
Oh, really? Okay, that's a great.
Which is a great combination. and they spoke to me, and one of their mantras actually is interesting to what you've just said, which is we don't want to make ethical machines which make ethical static decisions, right, that can't change. What we're trying to do is make machines that are making us better, so making moral decisions which are better and in a direction that we want to go. And that's
dangerous.
It is, but it implies the conversation. I think it implies that people have started to stipulate what better is, and that's what is interesting to me. So they're building in the fact that people have to make a decision about what is going to push us forward and not restrict us.
So I haven't read the book, and so I'll add it to my.
Well, it's to do with some of the later stuff, because they're actually doing some implementation stuff at the moment. So that's,
okay. I'll have to kind of read up on what they're talking about to be informed. I think the danger is if you've got machines that are making kind of choices, they're extensions of you. They are leverage of your choices, and so if you take the stance like a Tegmark type stance, which is, there is kind of one single truth, there is one single correctness. We are on a process to discover what that one single truth, what one single correctness is. And so once we've discovered that thing, then all we need to do is just get machines to just execute on that, and to hell with everyone else, because they'll be wrong. To me, that's the same sort of misguided philosophy that you might accuse a highly evangelical religious missionary of going off into the Amazon and trying to convert native people who've been living their way for 3,000 years. That person is going to come up with all sorts of frictions and maybe judge for certain things because of that. My way is right, and therefore my duty is to impose it on the world.
It's quite reductive, I think, as well.
It is
saying that there is almost a mathematical truth to kind of a moral imperative, which is, we presume couldn't be the case, being cultural beings, being social animals. So.
But I think by looking at how you distribute out ethical robots or whatever technology to people, so the problem is the people you give it to, you're giving a lot of power and leverage to those people to potentially enforce their view on the world on everyone else. And I think we need to reach some consensus on what lines do we not want crossing, and how do we want to kind of face some of those challenges before we let technologists run off and build some of this stuff. And I think we're already a little bit behind the curve on that problem. And that kind of brings me on to the thing about something like the trolley problem.
Yes. What's your feeling about the trolley problem?
So anyone who doesn't know, and we should probably start with that. So the trolley problem is the kind of I can't remember who came up with it, but it's a classical thought experiment. So steeped in philosophy, not in psychology really, rather than technology. But it's basically you've got a bunch of people on a train track. There's 5 on one side and 1 on the other, and you hold the switch. Your switch can only decide whether the 5 die or the 1 die, because there's a train hurtling towards them. And what do you do? And almost everyone says you pull the lever and kill the 1. And then there's a variation of that, which is you're now standing on a bridge in front of a rather large person, and there's 5 people on the track. If you push the person onto the track, the 1 person will die and derail the train, but the 5 people will be saved. And most people have a real difficulty with that, and you kind of see the opposite result: the 5 die rather than the 1. It's a really interesting question about analysing psychology, and it's an interesting philosophical thing to discuss. And I think that's where people get stuck, because as a thought experiment we could argue the right and the wrong, and we can rationalise it. But what people are talking about now is the trolley problem in relation to self-driving cars. And I think and this is the common thing I've heard, is like, the trolley problem is a really difficult problem. We've got to kind of build in a solution to this into self-driving cars, because self-driving cars are going to face this problem. And it's true, self-driving cars are going to face problems where, I inverted commas here, choices are going to have to be made as to who lives and who dies. But I think if you analyse how actually a real human would make that decision in the real world, not a thought experiment, but in a real world decision, and then how society deals with the consequences of that, that actually could inform how we solve this problem for self-driving cars. And so the reality is that if you were that person holding the lever, or that person on top of the bridge, the reality is you would make a decision. And then after you've made that decision, the police would turn up, the insurance company would turn up, the media reporters would turn up and say, what the hell did you do that for? And you would give a story.
Yeah.
And your story wouldn't be a detailed blow-by-blow account of the thought process you went through. Your story would be a post-rationalization of your own narrative towards that past event. That's how we, if you have a car accident, if you commit a murder, your thought process is your thought process of the time. But the story that gets judged is your narrative back towards that your justification of why you did what you did. And then we make a society, we have a solution for that, is that we say, well, either the police will say, okay, no crime has been committed, off you go, or they'll say, ooh, actually, we think this is actually contravening some sort of rule, and we're going to haul you in front of the courts. And the courts then decide two things. The first job of the courts in that kind of criminal case will be to decide the truth. Which again is a little bit of kind of legal hubris, because really what they're deciding is they're just going to collapse all possibilities onto a single narrative. But whether that's the truth or not is neither here or there. But it is. Right. We'll all agree on a single narrative, and that will be the narrative that you'll get judged against. So the court decides on actually what was the real thought process. So whatever invented story you came up with, neither here or there, they'll come up with a story, and then they'll say, does that truth break a law? And if it does, then how do we deal with that? So that's the process that the courts go through. So that's a human process, and we've done this for thousands of years. In the UK, we've got a 1,000-year-old legal system at least, and it kind of works. Ish.
Sometimes.
But it's the way that we outsource the difficulty of making these ethical decisions. We have laws, we have a balance of power, we have a court system, and we have a group of people that we call experts in truth, and we call them jurors, and we have a group of people that we call experts in ethics, and we call them lawyers and judges. With self-driving cars, the problem is that the car doesn't make a post-rational kind of decision. It doesn't kind of just do something random and then afterwards try and build a story out of it. The car actually has to make a choice, and that's very different to how a human works. And so I don't think you can give a car a bit of programming to solve that problem in that exact set of events that the car has. But I do think you can solve the problem in a different way, which is actually using the courts and using the legal system, but just making one small change to how they're set up. So one thing about the legal system is the legal system only tests real events. There's no example of the legal system testing hypothetical events. You can't go to court and say, if I was to kill my wife, how much time would I do? You would just be laughed out of the building. But we could quite easily set up a system whereby we have the same people in the same buildings, building the same case law, testing out some of these cases. The Trolley Problem case, if the car was coming on this, and they could have a mock trial where lawyers on both sides could come up with different arguments, and they could try and argue through what's the right thing to do and what would be the results. And I think it's for car companies to put forward to the courts and to pay for that process, to test out some of these questions and to really imagine what are likely scenarios that our cars are going to face. Let's test these scenarios out before the courts, and then the judges will come up with answers, and then the car company can quite easily appeal it to higher levels of authority if they wanted to. And that's the way and the media will get involved, and that's the way society can start to make decisions as to how do we deal with these problems. And then the job for the technologists becomes an easy job. The job for the technologist isn't the job of the computer scientist that has to program his ethical judgments into the machine and get it right. The job of the computer scientist then becomes simply make this car as best possible apply the law. And if the car failed in applying the law very well, then maybe it was badly engineered, and maybe the technologists are liable. And if the car did apply the law well, then there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
We can then deal with the liability after the scenes. And if the car finds a place where there's ambiguity in the law, then the car then makes a decision as to, based on case law, based on its views on the legal system, what's the judgment that it comes up with. And then that judgment can easily be tested in the courts, in a recursive fashion, to see whether that's a solution. And that's how you solve the trolley problem, using exactly the institutions we have today, 1,000 years of legal practice, and it's really down to just recognizing the difference between us as machines that post-rationalize and these things as machines that pre-rationalize.
I disagree with a lot of what you said.
That's wonderful. I'm pleased.
So we can either dig into that or we can not, and that's fine.
I'm happy either way.
But I really like the idea that we are getting ahead of that. The idea of getting ahead of the game with the hypothetical court situations. I like that because it means that people are thinking about the situations before they are occurred, and they're better prepared for when something does occur to make decisions about it.
Yeah.
I really like that. I think that's a great idea.
Unfortunately, we don't have a system that does that. At the moment, we have politicians that try and imagine this invented scenario, and then the courts are then there to try and kind of interpret what the kind of policy decisions were. And I actually think that mechanism doesn't work in this situation. I think we need to have this notion of mock courts. And I also believe that the legal process is its destiny is much more of a form of theatre on kind of ethical questions, as opposed to what it is today. I think it's evolving in that direction. So it kind of aligns to that view as well. But I'm interested to hear what you disagree with about this.
Okay, so I disagree with two main things. One,
only two.
Only two. The technology I disagree with, and the decision-making process I disagree with. So we do post-rationalize, but we still had to make the decision in the first place.
But we have no idea how we made that decision.
We do, because we're social beings. So there's two things. There's the nurture and the nature thing. But at the end of the day, if you were to put someone in a experiment where they had to make these decisions, they would make a decision. They would have to make a decision. So we can actually test for that. So we can do the same with machines, and we can actually negate all the court process, because actually, if you think about it, what we actually care about is what in a utilitarian form, right? Is what happens. All the post stuff is to do with how we make it better, to do with the insurance. It's actually not to do with what happened at all, because the thing happened in time and space, and it happened to someone, and it happened to a cat on the road, or it happened to a granny on the road. That's kind of that's my imperative, right? To make the thing that happens better. And I think what you're saying with the court situation is really interesting, and that could play into that. But it doesn't. It's not the thing that happened. And the technology point is the technology doesn't make decisions like that. It can't. Like, how would you do it? I know that you briefly watched the video about that I put out about automated cars and the trolley problem. The trolley problem, as you stipulated, is a useful psychological experiment. Interesting how it's basically to work out how people would react to certain circumstances. It's not a rule book about how we implement anything or the real world. It doesn't exist in the real world. The analogy in the real world would be a train going towards a person, 5 people on a track. But that's not what automated cars are. They're totally different. Automated cars, they work in physical reality of speed, deceleration, gravity, human psychology. It's far and surpasses the amount of information you actually have to compute to work out what's going to happen next.
But you can easily imagine a scenario where an autonomous vehicle...
You can imagine it, but you can't actually make this decision on board with the technology that we have.
But you can imagine a scenario where the vehicle has to choose between the least worst outcome.
But yes, I'll stop you there. So language narrative is not choice; it's possibility space.
Yeah. Okay. That's
my language. Exactly.
My bad for being a bit sloppy, but. Your choice or your decision is within least bad scenarios, and you've got to pick which is the least bad scenario.
It doesn't. It's a technology. It doesn't know what good and bad is.
No, but it has to pick between scenarios.
It doesn't. It could just do nothing.
That in itself is a choice.
But it's not a choice. It's a it's
a
possibility space.
That's a design choice. So the design choice.
No, because I'll take another route here. If I programmed an automated car to do random stuff, there's no ethical decisions there, right? It's just random stuff. So you could imagine computing. So this is my problem with the technology and the philosophy not coming together.
Yeah.
So the technology does not work how these people were talking about it.
Yeah.
And that comes down to the legislators, and that's a big problem.
But you're saying that if you build a piece of technology that makes random decisions,
yes,
that there's no relevant ethical judgment about that design choice you've made.
Only that you've made it do that in the first instance.
Yeah, but I think what I'm saying is that there's absolutely an ethical design choice in there
to make it random, but not the actual individual
or to do nothing.
Processes.
The scenario where you've got the 5 people on one side and the 1 person on the other, and the machine has a binary.
But that will never happen. We won't get bogged down in this, but in the real world, it's very rare that you have a binary choice in anything.
Yeah.
In your breakfast choices, in how you'll cycle your bike from moment to moment to moment to moment. The reality of binary doesn't really exist. It exists in a computer because you have ones and zeros.
Sure.
And that's what we're battling against.
But even if you've got multiple solutions,
they're not solutions. They're just things.
You have multiple goals, multiple endpoints, multiple predictions.
Predictions is totally true. Yeah.
So you still have to decide between which of those paths you're going to follow.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that the decision-making mechanism of how to decide at the moment is based on a value-based. The common lexicon is maybe insurance companies should answer this question based on dollar value.
And that's horrific, isn't it?
It is, or it should be like the driver has a weighting versus the passenger versus people externally.
Yes,
or you weight people by age, or you weight people by ethnicity, which is even more horrific. So you start to then laden the calculation with these measures. What I'm saying is there should be a more complex mechanism to evaluate those possibilities, and that is which is the most legal route. And the technologist objection to that is, well, that's a much more complex problem to solve than just calculating the value of an injury. And my answer is yes, absolutely. It's and we shouldn't let the things on the road until they've reached the level of sophistication where they can make those choices.
Yeah.
Being realistic.
Sure.
We've already got self-driving cars on the road.
Yes. In England especially, we don't have any laws against it.
Yeah, so. and most people don't realise that. And so this is the way we're going to solve this is unfortunately retrospective. The courts will decide on cases where things go badly wrong, and hopefully the big bet that everyone's placing is that nothing too badly wrong will go wrong.
Yes.
And these will be fringe cases, and we will move the needle towards an answer that way. But I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point.
I'm going to have to go in.
Sure.
Is that all right?
So, sorry we got a bit heated there.
No, it's not heated at all.
I've just got a lot to say about the trolley problem, as you know, and I'm.
I'd love to kind of battle that through with you more because I think I was being kind of sloppy with my language, but. I think debating that problem is actually very, very interesting.
Yeah. And I like what you said at the end with how you can. We're basically trying to make it better than good enough. Everyone's trying to make the system which is basically good enough, and we don't want good enough. We want. I think good, better,
and also taking the problems to the people that have the most competence in solving.